Now on Mississippi Insight. Will Jackson face a federal intervention as President Trump's urban crime strategy expands? We'll hear from the White House. And Russ Latino discusses the assassination of Charlie Kirk and more. That's all ahead this week on Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us for this September 14th edition of Insight. The White House is expanding its federal crime crackdown, and Jackson is now part of the national conversation. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt pointed to Jackson during a briefing this week as the administration defends President Trump's decision to send National Guard troops into troubled cities. Troops are already deployed in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and the president says New Orleans is next. Governor Tate Reeves has already sent 200 Mississippi National Guard soldiers to the nation's capital to support the effort. Democrats argue crime is highest in red states, but Republicans say the worst trouble is in Democrat-run cities.
I'm wondering if the president would consider working with red state governors to fix high crime in blue cities like in Memphis, Tennessee.
So first of all, I want to get to the premise of your question, Reagan, which is being pushed by Democrats, that there is crime in red states. Of course, there is crime in all states, but the crime in these cities is all in cities that are run by Democrats. If you look at the list of the top 20 high crime cities in the United States, every single one, with the exception of one in Louisiana, is run by a Democrat. And these Democrats have supported the same policies that I spoke about at the beginning of this briefing, like cashless bail. If you look at a red state, Mississippi, but a Democrat-run city in that state, Jackson, in 2019, Jackson, Mississippi eliminated cash bail for virtually all misdemeanor cases. And while Jackson is not formally a sanctuary city, the state of Mississippi formally banned sanctuary cities, and this city has acted as a de facto sanctuary city for criminals and illegal aliens since 2017. Same thing, Birmingham, Alabama, a Democrat-run city in a red state. In 2017, the Birmingham City Council unanimously passed a resolution, quote, committing to establish sanctuary policies. So if you actually look at the facts from these Democrat-run cities, these are cities that are run by Democrats and by by members of the Democrat Party. These are blue cities, and they have all supported these disastrous policies which allow repeated career criminals back onto the streets to further commit acts of violence. And so to answer your question, yes, the president wants to work with anyone across this country who wants to end these horrible policies and to bring law and order to our streets. And I think that is proven by his tremendous cooperation with the mayor of Washington, D.C. and our nation's capital. And just look at the results of that. And I do have some updates for you on the D.C. crime crackdown if anyone is interested. There have been a total of 2,177 arrests made since the start of the operation on August 7th. Just last night, there were 57 arrests made in Washington, D.C. Of the 57 arrests, there were 14 illegal aliens who were arrested, many of whom had prior criminal histories. And other arrests just last night in our nation's capital, so you all can be very grateful for this. Our great men and women of law enforcement, both federal and local, working together as they should, made an arrest on a warrant for assault with the intent to kill. The subject shot 2 adult males after an altercation. They made an arrest on a warrant for an armed carjacking. The subject assaulted an adult male in the face with a firearm and then took his keys. We also made an arrest on a warrant for simple assault and the destruction of property and subsequently charged with second-degree theft. Last night in D.C., there was an arrest for possession of a controlled substance with second-degree theft. There was an arrest for possession of a controlled substance with the intent to distribute. That subject, the person is also a subject of interest in a homicide and a carjacking. Last night in D.C., we also arrested a felon in possession of a firearm who was carrying that firearm without a license. So these are the career criminals. These are the bad guys that we are picking up in Washington, D.C. every day. The president would love to do this in every Democrat-run city across the country, and he hopes that more Democrats will call the White House to allow us to help them.
One more that's D.C. specific. Congress is poised to not extend Trump's federalization of the D.C. police. Mayor Bowser signed an executive order formalizing cooperation with federal forces. You just mentioned all the success that the operation has had. Does the White House believe that the Mayor Bowser's action is enough to continue the crime crackdown?
We are very grateful for the mayor's cooperation in this effort, and we look forward to continuing to work with her and the Metropolitan Police Department. Bloomberg.
Jackson's newly elected mayor responded quickly with this quote, saying Jackson is committed to protecting the rights and privileges of every resident. I look forward to hearing from President Trump on how he can support our city's revitalization through federal resources, end quote. Monitor 12 News for developments on this story. Up next on Insight, Russ Latino and the death of Charlie Kirk. A man is now in custody for the deadly shooting of political activist Charlie Kirk, but that assassination echoes still in America's divisive political discourse. We spoke last week with Magnolia Tribune's Russ Latino and got his perspective on this terrible attack.
It's devastating. Obviously, a young guy, 31 years old, had a wife, had 2 kids. Regardless of what you thought about his politics or his perspective, nobody deserves what happened today. And it's also devastating for our country, I think, Byron. I mean, if you think about what that means, we've gotten to the point as a country where you see this escalation of political violence today resulting in a tragic death. And we should never be at the point that we demonize people that we disagree with to the extent that we have and create an environment for this kind of political violence.
I mean, what does it say where we are today? I mean, there was a point where we could agree to disagree and we would walk away. So what happened that we got to this point?
Yeah, I just think we see people that we disagree with now as more than somebody that might see the world differently. I think we see them as being evil. And there's a lot of rhetoric that would suggest that our political opponents are evil. I said elsewhere that I think we've turned politics into a false god, and I think we've turned our political opponents into false satans. And it makes it a lot easier to justify something like political violence if you see somebody across from you with different views as being fundamentally evil.
Charlie Kirk was not a politician, but he was a very loud voice on the conservative side. Why do you think he was targeted?
I don't know the answer to that because it's too early to know what the motive of the shooter was. There's going to be a lot of speculation about that between now and whenever we actually know facts. I will say this, that I think Charlie Kirk was one of the more effective conservative pundits or voices out there in the new media. And I think sometimes when you rise to that level of success and have the type of following that he had garnered, it also invites a target. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of what happened here.
What do you think happens or what should happen moving forward?
In an ideal world, we'd all calm down a little bit. But that's pretty idealistic for me to say that, right? I think if we could start thinking about the debates that we have in this country over policy, not in terms of personalities, not in terms of, immutable characteristics, but instead in terms of, hey, actually, there's a lot of agreement across the political aisle on what the end objective is. The real question is, how do we get there? And if we could have those kind of good-natured debates, I think we'd be better off. Unfortunately, I have a hard time believing we're headed that direction. It feels like things are getting worse, that it's easier to just reduce down your opponent based on a quick label than it is to actually have substantive debate. And I think it's problematic long-term for the country.
Do you think the days of being able to break bread together with somebody that from a different side, do you think those days are gone, or do you think we can ever get back to that?
I think when you get back to that, I think part of it, though, is going to require us stepping back from things like social media. I think there's a chronically online segment of our society that all they read are the most extreme things, right, or the most conspiratorial things. And this happens on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum. I'm not targeting one side or the other. But what I find is when you go out in your community or you go to your church or you go to your Friday night football game, it doesn't really matter what people's backgrounds are. There's still humanity there, and there's still the ability to get along there and see the good in other people. I think we need to do more of that and less of sort of the sensational, constantly online, constantly reading blogs that are really designed to get clicks. They're designed to make you mad. And so I think to some degree, the media has some responsibility because there's this conflict, and we're both in the media, but there's this conflict between what gets eyeballs and maybe what's in the best interest of the public.
Mm-hmm. You think this is a wake-up call to where we are as a country today in our politics?
It certainly should be. I think what I've seen in the American people of late is that we get upset about something for a couple of days, and then we move on and get upset about something else. I think this is different, fundamentally different, that what appears to be the case is that somebody gets targeted for what they believe and how they express themselves. And it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with somebody. Words are not violence, and they should not justify violence. And so, yeah, I mean, my hope is that we see some change in the way that we act and think. But I've also already seen some, things that make me cynical, where people are trying to say, how does this help President Trump, or how does this hurt President Trump? And there's already sort of posturing politically around what is a human tragedy.
Mm. What's your hope? I guess as we move forward, that if you could have a wish or a hope, what would you hope that at the end of the day that we get from this in a positive way?
My hope would be that we started to demonstrate grace towards other people, right? And it's very easy to demonstrate grace or show grace to people that you already agree with. But a real extension of grace is to people that maybe you don't agree with, who you find some of their activity to be displeasing. And I think if we could start seeing each other as human beings, even when we disagree, even when we come from different backgrounds, if we could extend that grace and not assume the worst of people, we'd be a whole heck of a lot better off.
Let's talk a little bit about this week in your latest column. You argue the Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is right about America's chronic disease epidemic. What do you think his administration is getting wrong?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I absolutely think that he's right that America's suffering from a health crisis of sorts. And I'm an offender of this, but I would say our lifestyle habits in America, the abundance of easy, ultra-processed foods, has led to a series of problems with weight, and the result of that problem with chronic disease like diabetes and heart conditions and all of that. So he is right about America's dietary and lifestyle habits and the impact that's having on the healthcare system. I think where there's real question is when he tries to connect it to things that don't seem as readily apparent to be connected. So vaccines are a great example of this, where the overwhelming majority of the scientific and medical community think vaccines are one of the greatest inventions in scientific history. And he is trying to sort of pull that into the conversation about America's health crisis in a way that doesn't really feel causally connected, and in a way that I think is generating actually some friction with the Trump administration itself, Byron, because the president has in the last week lauded himself for Operation Warp Speed, which was the effort to bring on the COVID vaccine at the height of the COVID pandemic. And the president has come out and said over the course of this week that he thinks that there are a lot of vaccines that are safe, effective, that they work. Pure and simple was the language that he used. And so at some level, it seems like Secretary Kennedy has identified what is a real problem in America's health landscape, but maybe hasn't identified the root causes. And it's not clear that there's actually a strategy to address that problem.
Mississippi has been known to take vaccines, particularly when it comes to schools, and a lot of these issues have been, not a big problem for Mississippi because we've been well vaccinated in the past, particularly if there are schools. How does that relate for a lot of folks like here in the state of Mississippi?
You saw after that hearing that was sort of contentious, Secretary Kennedy went to Capitol Hill to testify in front of the Senate Finance Committee, and he talked with both Democrats and Republicans that were critical of some of the things that the administration was doing at HHS. Secretary Kennedy has sort of dismantled the advisory panel that was responsible for making vaccine recommendations. He's ended a series of grants that went towards vaccine development, and some of what they're promulgating now will make it really, really difficult to get their hands on the COVID vaccine. In the wake of that, the state of Florida came out and said, we're no longer going to have mandates for kids attending schools that they be forced to take these vaccines. I think there's a movement in Mississippi and has been for quite a while to do something very similar in Mississippi. And, I think the scientific community certainly is concerned about that. You saw Dr. Dan Edney, who runs the health department in the state of Mississippi, come out and basically caution against it because Mississippi has had such strong adoption of vaccines like measles, mumps, and rubella. We haven't seen outbreaks of those things. In other communities where they've laxed or loosened the regulations around those things, what you've seen or starting to see are breakouts. I think it's really, really important for people to understand at some level that it's easy for us to say, well, what have vaccines ever done for us? Because we haven't gotten to see polio. We haven't gotten to see smallpox. And the reason that we've not experienced those things are the vaccines themselves. So it's easy to forget the good that scientific development has done in some of this conversation.
Yeah, you see the president moving forward with federal crime suppression and immigration raids in Chicago, Massachusetts. He suggested that Baltimore and even New Orleans will be also possibly a target. Are you worried that this situation might spiral as opponents line up against these deployments?
I don't know that I'm worried that it might spiral. I think what you see, even when the president is talking about going into Chicago and almost inviting the governor of Illinois to invite him into Illinois, is there is both a constitutional and a statutory limitation on the deployment of the National Guard. Um, the way that it's designed is that the governor of that state would literally invite the National Guard in. That's not happened in Illinois. So it could very well set up a legal question. I mean, we're dealing with doctrines and laws. The Alien Sedition Act, the Supreme Court recently reviewed, or the Fifth Circuit rather recently reviewed as well, and found that the Trump administration was overstepping there. That's a law from like 1798, right? So we're dealing with doctrines and laws that are incredibly old in a new way, and we'll see how it comes down. Ultimately, the Supreme Court will decide most of these questions.
26 U.S. Senate race in Mississippi is almost certain. What factors give Senator Hyde Smith such an advantage despite the possibility of it possibly being an ugly campaign? Russ, you've written repeatedly about school choice. House leaders suggest it will be a priority in the 2026 session. And the president spoke on this also this week. What is your position on school choice, and what is it about school choice that you support?
Yeah, so look, I believe in public investment in the education of children. I think it leads to them being productive members of society. And so to me, if you were to look back at sort of the Jeffersonian idea of why we spend public money on education, it's not to fund individual systems. It's to fund the preparation of children for the rest of their lives. And there are some children that are really well prepared in the public school where they live. And there are some children who are not. And so if the point of spending public dollars on education is to prepare kids for life, then we should want that kid to be in the very best setting possible to seize their potential in that opportunity. And that's the essence of school choice. The other part that I think is appealing to a lot of parents is that ultimately parents know their kids best, right? Parents are the ones that care the most about the outcome for their children. And so at some level, we should trust the basic building block of society, the family, to make decisions to figure out what that best setting is going to be. And so that's in a nutshell why I support it. And we've seen in other states that it's worked. We've seen in other states where it's starting to take hold. And I think there's an opportunity in Mississippi, particularly this year.
Schools. What's your position on that?
Yeah, I think it's a silly argument. Take a Pell Grant as an example. Pell Grants are used for low-income students. It's a federal program, and it allows them to go to the college of their choice. It doesn't just allow them to go to public colleges. It allows them to go to private colleges. And so we acknowledge in the context of higher education all the time that public money can go to private schools because the point of the public money is not to support a system or a brick and mortar building, but to support the student's education. And so I think that argument doesn't hold a lot of water. I think the other part of it is you look at outside of the context of education, Byron, there are dozens and dozens of examples where the state uses public money with private vendors to accomplish a public good. Road building is a great example of that, right? So with road builders, we don't have our own team of road builders, right? We go out and we hire companies that build roads. We use public money to a private institution for them to accomplish a public good. To me, it's really no different.
Access to that money to help pay for their schooling?
Yeah, so it depends on how the system gets set up, but the answer is yes. I mean, the whole goal of this is to make sure that a kid who maybe doesn't have a family with a deep bank account, if they have a better chance at another school, that they still have the same opportunity as a family that does have a deep bank account. And so the way that these things work, they're called ESAs, education savings or scholarship accounts, is essentially that a percentage of the state expenditure for that kid that's already put into the budget would be, the family would be allowed to use that at another place if they desire to use it at another accredited institution of learning. And so, yes, this is not the kind of thing where you're just giving it to a select few. The goal of this is to create universal choice, that no matter where somebody lives or the size of their parents' bank account, they're going to have the same opportunity as somebody that's well off living in an affluent community.
Big thanks to Russ Latino for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.